So one of the things I talked about as being a producer is looking at a story, evaluating its content to determine if it's going to be a good news story or not, and if it's going to fit well into your show. So with that, I want to talk about the 12 ingredients for a powerful news story. And a story doesn't have to have all of these. It could have one, it could have more. It may have all 12, but that's going to be a very rare case. But if your story and the content you're looking at has at least a couple of these, then you probably have a good story that you can present for your newscast. So a couple that we're going to kick off is, number one, if it's new and interesting information, something that's going to surprise the audience and make them say, wow, I didn't know that. For the local news, when we talked about the country club allowing women for the first time in over 100 years. That was new and interesting. And related news, there was a story that had come out about the last male black rhino had passed away. And at this point, the rhinos, the black rhino or the species, were at extinction. There were no more males. And so scientists and veterinarians were able to go to this last rhino, and they collected skin cells, DNA samples, blood, tissue, and semen, and they're hoping to be able to artificially inseminate some of the remaining female black rhinos to bring the population back from complete extinction. If that's not the case, then they may look into cloning as a possibility as the technology gets better into the future. Number two, impact. How does this story affect your viewers? Why is it important? So right now in the United States, there is a major concern about student debt. So if you have a story that talks about the president is possibly going to forgive student debt for either a certain number of people or a certain amount of money, then if your story starts relating to how it will impact college students or people trying to get mortgages, then that would be a good story to present to them. Another type is humanizing a story by providing real people. There was a case a while back where there was another mass shooting, which is something that happens far too often in the United States. But one of the things that they wound up doing was they didn't talk about the shooter. They talked about the victims. And what they were able to do is, my head's in the wrong spot for this. When they started showing the pictures, they showed a football coach and a bunch of students who were the victims of this shooting. And then in this story, the football coach held his body against a door to protect a bunch of students that were in the classroom. So he wound up saving lives by his sacrifice. And so they were putting real faces to this tragedy and talking about how Aaron Fees in Parkland was a hero for the act that he did, even though it wound up ultimately costing his life. But instead of just saying, we have another shooting, there's another mass shooting going on, this time they were actually putting faces to it and kind of drawing the audience in. So it's not just facts and data. These were actual people that it happened to. And so you can use that humanizing to kind of to put a face to it and to kind of draw your audience in. Now up next, background. If there's a story that provides background and insight into something that people didn't know before, that would make for a good story. In the case of Flint, Michigan water, people were noticing that the water was always turning brown and dingy, and it was no longer fit for human consumption. And one of the things that they found out later on in their investigation was that the pipes that were feeding the city's water were old and corroded and were never replaced. So having a story like this is providing background to a current situation that's going on. Up next is context, where you take an individual example and you put it into a larger context. So one case was a story that had come out of a father who was walking his daughter from their front of the house to the bus down the street. And once the daughter was in the bus, the immigration police came out and arrested him right then and there. And his daughter was screaming and yelling to get out of the bus and see her dad, but the bus was driving away while he was being arrested. And this had come out because immigration had increased the number of illegal aliens that they were processing for immigration purposes. And so to take this story into context, the reporter in the station talked about, if this happened to this one person, this is happening to more and more people across the country. And if you are in the country illegally, there's a good chance that this story could happen to you, regardless of how long you've been living in the country. So they were taking this example and putting it into context for their viewers. Another thing is evidence. This is where you use specific examples and compelling anecdotes to provide facts and information. So one of the stories that we talked about was, or that we looked at earlier, was a story about the reporter who had the people in the winter talk to the people in the summer, and how each were saying, it's horrible right now, I wish it were the other season. And one of the things he talked about was that there is a comfort zone for the human body between 68 and 78 degrees. If you move outside of those two temperatures, you're going to start getting uncomfortable. So he's providing evidence to back up the information he has by telling the people, by letting the people of the summer talk to the people of the winter, and vice versa. The next thing is color and good quotes. So if you have a good description and dialogue, they can help the reader see and hear what the story is all about. So the quote here is, all that is required for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. So if your story has compelling descriptions and compelling dialogue, people who are telling the story in such a way that it is very understandable and very easy to relate to, that can also make for a very powerful news story. Up next, number 8, the clear explanations. It's also like a dumbing down of information. If the reporter kind of avoids jargon and acronyms that the audience may find confusing, and in the end, they wind up using the most simplest terms to explain things to the audience. So at one of the many points when there was a mass shooting, people were talking about the different types of guns that were being used, like the M4 versus the AR-15. And one of the things I saw, which I thought was interesting, was that on many occasions there were reporters who didn't know what they were talking about. They were just giving terms that they had heard. And one of the terms was a fully automatic gun versus a semi-automatic gun. And really quick, like semi-automatic is every time you pull the trigger, a single bullet will leave. A fully automatic is when you hold the trigger down and all the bullets go out at one time. And there were even reporters who were classifying guns as fully semi-automatic, which does not exist. So now the reporters were losing credibility because they weren't using correct information. But they were trying to explain what different types of guns were and what different types of firing was. And so finally, a reporter said, here's the difference between automatic and semi-automatic, and there's not a fully semi-automatic. So they did a clear explanation of explaining the term for people at home to better understand. Another type of story is accuracy and fairness. So I'll just kind of disappear real quick to show you the picture behind me. So again, in the case of the story of Publix and the trailers, the reporter first got the interviews from the residents who were talking about that they were being evicted unfairly from their homes in the trailer park. And then the reporter went to the city and talked to the property managers, and they were able to get both sides of the story, and they presented both sides for the audience to make up their own mind and determine if the people were being treated fairly or unfairly. Wrong button. And then the last 3. You've got comments from the experts. So a lot of times reporters and anchors will give you information, but to help a story out, if you have an expert that can give you that information, then you have an authoritative figure who can relate to the people at home. So in the case of COVID, many times we were talking to doctors and healthcare providers about what COVID could do, how it was presented, how it hurt humans, how it could be cured, or how it could be treated. At one point during President Trump's first few months in the office. He was putting together a very large tax reform. And a lot of times reporters and anchors didn't understand all the nuances that were in the new bills. So they wound up going to tax preparers and people who were professional CPAs and who understood the tax code, and having these experts provide an explanation of what was going on made it easier for the audience to understand. Now, also a diversity of voices. If you can get a wide variety of different types of people providing input and insight into something, you're able to spread your story out to not one particular audience, but to a wider range. So sometimes during politics, you'll have a politician talking to a group of different people. They could be male, female, teenagers, middle-aged, elderly. They could be different races, different religions, different nationalities. So having all these different diversity of voices makes it more appealing, because you're getting all these various perspectives from the audience, and something that the audience can relate to. And then also, there's just a good organization of a story. If a story is told from a perspective that is clear, precise, and makes sense. Again, going back to the story of the summer and the winter people talking to each other. At the very beginning, he started talking with the people of summer, and they were all saying how horrible it was. And then he went and talked to the people of the winter, and they were telling the summer people how horrible it was. And then he proceeded to explain why everybody felt that the time they were in was worse, and why they perceived the other time as better. And so he was able to kind of correlate that information from those perspectives in a very organized manner. And he was able to do that very well. And so that made for a very powerful storytelling. And so that's a look at where we get a lot of information and content as a producer, and why you're able to grab all these different sources of information, and you can use that to create a story of what's going on in the world that day. And so by looking at these different sources, different types of media, different information, you're able to weave them together into a very complex but well organized newscast that you can present to your